hit record.
Now?
Yes. And are we good on the YouTube part? We're good? All right. Hey, everybody. Happy Friday. Oh, let me take my Chappelle mask off. Well, the wife and I had our first little celebratory date last night. We went to see Chappelle, and it was very eventful. It was fun. He's just a brilliant comedian and cultural critic, and we were celebrating being good parents, at least so far. We haven't ruined one kid. Now we're trying not to ruin another one. But thank you for joining us. Today we're going to continue our conversation around politics of humanity with a focus on education. But one quick note, last week we talked about shifting the culture. And I was talking about the police and the numbers in terms of how dangerous we're told the job is versus what the numbers show. And thanks to my dad, he sent me an article from CNBC back in the spring of 2019 that had the top 10 list of most dangerous jobs. The number one most dangerous job in America is logging. And policing didn't make the top 10. So there's that. As always, we want to just take some time to breathe and create some synchronicity and honor our ancestors. So we'll breathe in, breathe out, breathe in, and breathe out. Breathe in all the goodness the universe has for all of us. Out all the anxieties, tension, and stress. Breathe in. And breathe out. And in America, you know, there are several days where it makes sense to honor our ancestors. And this happens to be one of those days. 9/11, 2001, you know, planes hit the World Trade Center buildings and 3,000 lives were lost. And however you kind of think about that situation, anytime lives are lost senselessly, that is a tragedy. Regardless of all the, you know, things that led up to it and what happened after it, focusing on those people who became ancestors is what's most important, and how that impacted the lives of their families and our country, and in some cases even the world. We never know what those folks, some of them, may have done, right? So as we're thinking about our ancestors, let's even broaden that scope more to think about, you know, folks who we don't even know, who are guiding the people who they were important to and were important to them, as well as the people who are important to us. So we'll play the ancestral drum call. Please put your family members and important, honored ancestors in the chat, and we'll call them. Ashe. We have
Willis D. Sanders Sr.
Willis D. Sanders Sr. Ashe.
and Jr.
And Jr. Willis D. Sanders Jr. Ashe.
Beulah Sanders.
Beulah Sanders Ashe.
Frank and Ella Hubbard.
Frank and Ella Hubbard Ashe.
Edward and Ernestine Cox.
Edward and Ernestine Cox Ashe.
Edward William Cox Jr.
Edward William Cox Jr. Ashe. Ashe, Ashe. Oh, again, we honor all of those called and not called, born and unborn, who continue to guide us in doing the work of creating a better world. Like I said, last week we talked about shifting the culture toward an environment that politics of humanity, politics being the negotiation of power, and humanity being our collective sense of who we are. Today, I want to focus on education, because as we started this politics of humanity conversation, we said there were three things, many things, but three macro categories, I think, that if we focused on building out the changes, revolutionary and evolutionary changes in these three macro spaces, then we'd be well on our way to creating a better, more just and equitable country and world. The first was a shifting culture. The second was education, and the third was adding value. So today we're going to focus on education. Our honored ancestor Frederick Douglass said, "Power concedes nothing without demand. It never did, and it never will." This quote is often used to justify a lot of things, but especially recently, protests against the inhumane treatment of Africans in America. It is absolutely true that power concedes nothing without demand, but it also begs the question, what is the nature of such a demand that would force power to concede? In fact, what does it mean to concede anything? To concede is to admit something is true or valid after first having denied that truth or the validity of that thing. It is the act of surrender or yielding, but also it is the act of giving, as in granting or allowing something to happen. We've always drawn from these words that power concedes nothing without demand, but have we really taken our ancestor out of context? I think that Douglass was smart enough to realize that there was a difference between his ability personally to wrestle and beat his oppressor and pray with his legs and take his freedom. There was a different fight with a different opponent in that one-on-one confrontation that led to his ultimate freedom than it is the fight to end systemic oppression and ideas of white supremacy, racist ideals, as Ibram Kendi says, right? Fighting an individual, in his case, he won, he gained his freedom. Had he lost, he would have still been enslaved. Different form of combat than fighting these larger systems that have built infrastructure around them to reify their goal and their purpose and the outcome, right? But if it is true that power concedes nothing without demand, then we have to understand what power really is. We have to understand what aspect of conceding we are demanding, whether it's the admission of something that has been denied but is true, or something we want to be surrendered, granted to us, or allowed, right? In each of those cases, whether there's an admission of something that has been denied but is true, or the surrender of something, the granting of something, or allowing something, power in this case still is held with those in power, by those in power, right? So it's not necessarily this I think the context that has shifted as we use those words in the contemporary setting is that power concedes nothing without demand, and that demand is for power. Therefore, there's a shift in who holds the power. I don't know that Frederick Douglass meant it that way in the context in which he was speaking. And the definition of concede suggests that he was using that word purposefully to, in a sense that he understood what power was, and that power would not necessarily shift hands, but that if the demand had enough energy behind it, it could force power to concede, which means to grant or allow, right? because if you're surrendering, that's a shift in power. But I don't know that that was even in his mind in that way based on his other writings. Please, if you've read Douglass and you think differently, put it in the chat. I'd love to have that conversation as well. We must also understand then that what we are demanding should have something embedded in it if we're taking power the way Douglass did. It would have something that would elicit an action from power to concede whatever it is we're asking for, right? The fact that this isn't something that is easily articulated by Africans in America, right? There's that whole conversation about, well, we're not a monolith and we all want different stuff. Well, you know, I get that. And the fact that we're not a monolith in Black America and in America at large is really our greatest strength, our greatest asset. But the fact that we cannot uniformly express what the demands are based on our cultural situation in America, right? Not just from the deficit perspective, but also from the strength perspective. You know, the fact that we cannot say as a people, these are the 3 to 5 things that would make Black America better and agree on those macro areas is part and parcel of failure of education. And the fact that American marginalized folks, so let me rephrase that. The fact that those who are marginalized in America cannot uniformly express how marginalized people need to move more into the main and be accepted and participate as fully enfranchised citizens is also a failure of the American education system at large. What do I mean by that? Well, if you take what John Henry Clark said, that education should be preparing students for power, to understand power, to wield it in the in the effort to make sure that their people have what they need to be healthy, happy, and whole, right? In the interest of their people, then education has failed, because what it does, as my father and I discussed last week, the American education system really teaches us to understand things, right? There's a difference between understanding and knowing. Understanding means, oh, I get it. I know what that is, right? Knowing means not only do I know what it is, but I can affect that thing. I know it well enough that I can change, right? There's a difference. When you understand your job, you're a better cog in the economic wheel, right? But when you know your job, you can now create jobs for other people. It's a different thing, right? So the question is then, if education, and there again are 3 books, all titled The Dumbing Down of America, with different subtitles. You don't have to take my word for it. You can go find them yourself and read them. They're very disheartening, if not fascinating reads, because in each case, and I've only read, you know, parts of all 3 of them, but in each case they are outlining the ways in which America has not just dumbed down its citizenry, but the why of the dumbing down, which is really about power and the maintenance of racist ideals, or what Harvard professor David Yakovon says is white supremacist ideals, right? So if education is failing to help our young people understand power, and by education I'm really referring to public education, it can only be intentional about that failure, because we know how to teach people. We, as Americans, had the first high schools. We have led education until very recently. And so if we were so great at educating young people, and then 30 years out from the end of this, 40 years out from the end of the civil rights movement, we are falling behind in all of those public educational metrics when compared to the other parts of the world, then there has to be a reason why, right? And I would suggest that that failure is to maintain the status quo. And what we'll understand, hopefully, throughout this conversation about the history of education to a certain extent, and how we can reimagine education, is that the status quo since before the founding of America has been white supremacy, right? That's what America is founded on. And in order, again, we said a few weeks ago, we have to really deal with the DNA, the bones of the country, in order to remake the country in a way that's equitable and just for all of us, right? So we really just have to understand this history. And so in order to shift the status quo, we have to figure out how to shift the way and the why of our teaching and education process. So I'll deal with the problems and suggest my thoughts for potential, at least theoretical solutions after I play another piece. Solid. So we have to understand what power is, and we've talked about that. We have to understand what concessions we want and how those take shape. And if we want a shift in power, then we have to educate and prepare young people to understand, to hold, and to wield it in the interest of the many and not the few, right? So here are my thoughts about how we do that. So the major problem with the education in America is that it's inequitable across the whole scope, right? There are countries in the world that have outlawed, like literally, it's illegal to have private education because they want to make sure that the culture is communicated effectively across the country, right? In America, if you have the resources, you get better education because you can pay for it. And if you don't, you get this, literally separate and unequal education that now is not just segregated by race, but even more so by class, right? So we have to first address those inequalities across race, class, and gender in terms of how American education takes place. What it does on that lower level really is training young people to work for the upper class, right? One cool example that really illustrates this, and it's cool because, it's music and it's not these other more important issues, but my wife went to private school, I went to public school, and I remember having a conversation with her years ago, and she told me she learned about Charlie Parker in college or in high school. And I was like, you learned about Charlie Parker in high school? We didn't talk about people like that, African-American artists of note who were revolutionary or transformative in their craft in high school or grade school at all. We didn't even talk about revolutionary black composers in the 10 years or so I was a composition student, right? So the fact that she learned about this part of American culture in private school suggests, just as one example, how different private school education is from public school. Or we have some more ancestors, let's call them.
Ed Bell.
Ed Bell, Ashe.
Edna Bell.
Edna Bell, Ashe.
Charles Bell.
Charles Bell, Ashe.
William Bell.
William Bell, Ashe.
George Bell.
George Bell, Ashe.
Danielle Bell.
Danielle Bell, Ashe.
Larry Baker Jr.
And Larry Baker Jr., Ashe. We will always take that time. It's important. So like I said, there's a difference in educating people to understand as opposed to know, right? When you know, there's power behind that to affect change. There's agency. When you just understand, and you just kind of go along with the flow, right? Status quo. So what American education does at the lower level, the public education that I experienced, right? And public education, I know there are variables. If you are in a public school setting in an affluent area, your education may be closer to a private school education, but that is still a class separation, right? And so for folks who cannot afford either by the neighborhood you can afford to live in or private school education, the educational approach is totally different, right? On the one level, the free public education, in many cases, you are being trained to be a cog in the economic wheel. On the other level, you're trained in a different way to be the controllers or the masters of that wheel, right? These are overgeneralizations, but it is what it is. And there are people who go back and forth in that economic strata, but still, the numbers show that if you're an African American and you're in the top quartile of earners in America, therefore you are kind of in that more affluent educational space, you still have as great an likelihood of falling out of that class strata as you, or a higher likelihood of falling out of that class strata than if you were a white kid in that same affluent area, right? So there are all these problems, there are all these nuances. We just don't have time to get deep into the details. So I'm going to be general and then be as specific as possible. But cog in the wheel, on the one hand, master of that wheel, on the other hand, those who understand often, again, are exploited in that economic wheel, and those who know have the power to change and do. in any case, if you're not in that space with a consciousness of what power is and how to leverage and wield that power for the interest of all, then you are still being trained to maintain the status quo, right? Harvard historian David Yakovon, associate professor at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research and winner of the 2013 W.E.B. Du Bois Medal, is known for co-authoring a book with Henry Louis Gates Jr. called The African Americans, Many Rivers to Cross. He's now writing a book called Teaching White Supremacy, the textbook battle over race in American history. Dr. Yakovon is white, he's European American, and he's a scholar of African and African American history, but his research has found that the formation of American identity as the foundation, of American identity as white supremacy is a development of the North, not the slave-holding South, as the narrative often has been perpetuated, right? We think that because slavery really was in the South, really, quote unquote, then that's where all the bad stuff was. No, America was built on the foundation of slavery, and his research backs that up. He says slavery existed in the North and the South, and he cites Canadian John H. Van Avery, or Every, as the father of white supremacy, meaning that this guy, Van Avery, really did write many of the first or foundational ideas for why white supremacy would be the foundation of what would become America, right? It really was about power, because race is about power. Racism is a power dynamic. And again, politics of humanity means that we are restructuring that power dynamic in a way that works for all of us, and education is a way to do that. He found that democracy was considered to be an evil in the 17th and 18th century. And you got to think about it. This is coming from a European context of feudalism, right? So the aristocracy, the lords of the landlords, owned the land and everything on it, including the people, right? So democracy, in and of itself, conceptually, upsets that power dynamic, right? And in this time, the 17th into the 18th century, Dr. Yakovon's research shows that democracy was not really something that was favorable, but that John H. Van Avery, I don't know how to pronounce his name, Evrie, Avery, something. Huh? It's French. Oh, see, that's that private school education coming out. It's French. Okay, this dude from Canada named John, he argued that they should use democracy in what would become America, not because it leverages the ideas and ideals of the many, but because at that time, as a statistical majority, the European descendant peoples in what would become America could use their majority status to keep enslaved Africans in place, to hold them in check, right? So his idea of democracy was using majority rule in favor of the white supremacist infrastructure that he was arguing for, right? Again, this is before the founding of the country. These are the ideals upon which America was built, right? And further, that dude John said that this notion of racial superiority not only preceded the birth of the United States, but is the foundation of the country's educational philosophy, right? Dr. Yakovon says, white supremacy is like a toxin. The older history textbooks, now he researched over 3,000 textbooks ranging from before the nation became a nation and up until more contemporary times in his search to really understand how education has put out these or reinforced these racist ideals. He says, white supremacy is like a toxin. The older history textbooks were like syringes that injected the toxin of white supremacy into the minds of many generations of America. I'll say that again. White supremacy is like a toxin. The older history textbooks He even cited one book written by Noah Webster of Merriam-Webster's dictionary. That was, he said, full of white supremacist ideas. The textbooks were like syringes that injected the toxin of white supremacy into the minds of many generations of Americans. Now, if education was the syringe used to spread the toxin of white supremacy, then it can and should be the syringe that is used to distribute the antidote, right? The truth of our collective humanity. So we've established that, and there's a book coming out that shows that the history of American education has been founded on white supremacist ideas. And that didn't change when the American education system became integrated in as much as it is. It is actually more segregated now than it was leading up to Brown v. Board. But that segregation, like I said, is more along the lines of race and class rather than just race. And so those ideals, yes. Oh, my wife's giving me signals. I thought she was doing that public-private school thing.
No. And then we have some ancestors.
Oh, let's do that now.
Okay. Caroline Woods.
We have more ancestors. Caroline Woods, Ashe.
Louise Lewis.
Louise Lewis, Ashe. Cool. We'll always take time to remember, because remembering our ancestors helps us remember who we are.
You were just flowing.
Yeah, it's all good. It's all good. So, Dr. Yakovan's work shows and will show in the forthcoming book how the American education system, through analysis of the textbooks throughout the years, has been built on and perpetuated white supremacist ideals. When the American education system became integrated, those ideals then spread to infect non-white people in America, because the foundation of the education system did not change to recognize and reflect the broader population of students. Does that make sense? So that's why we have a stronger sense of internalized depression and surplus powerlessness in students of color, particularly black students, because the society is telling them through media that they have no value. And when they go to school, they're not learning the history that should shore up and really realize a self-concept that is healthy. So they're not learning about themselves in a positive way, right? Which means that when we see these acts of violence, or what folks will say, oh, you know, they're criminals, the criminalization of black bodies, particularly boys, young boys and youth and girls. We have to understand why that is happening. And one of the reasons that is happening is not the breakdown of the black family. In fact, the strength of the black family is what led to the modern civil rights movement in the 60s. It was the destruction, systematic destruction of the black family through educational systems, crack epidemic, and so on and so forth. School-to-prison pipeline, prison industrial complex, all things we've talked about before, right? Focus on education, because what we often don't discuss in America is how the educational system reinforces these ideas and ideals that lead to this destructive behavior. Make sense? Cool. So, because the education system is built on these poor bones, just like the wider American culture, there is no onus on educators in the public sector, in the public education system, to develop fully happy, healthy, and whole human beings, right? You just can't, especially when you're teaching to a test, right? The test, again, cog in the wheel. Can you learn this task? And can you demonstrate knowledge of that task and do that task? Yes, cool, you passed the test. Not can you think through to a solution, you know, for a problem that your classmates or your school or your community has identified, and find a solution that helps the most people be better after implementation of that solution, right? Those are two different approaches to education. The problem there is not, well, high school, the whole reason why we have high school, we're the first country in the world to have something called high school, right? The reason why we had that is because of capitalism, industrialization. We need to make sure that we had a trained workforce to work on these lines, assembly lines, and develop the Ford cars and build those cars and build, the roadways and everything in America. So high school was really a technical idea first that provided the labor force for the captains of industry, the capitalists of America. Then it evolves, and we have this shift away from skilled trades to college and debt. The median average, or the average college student graduates with about $40,000 in student loan debt, and still has to go get more debt to get a good job that'll pay them enough to pay that debt, and then maybe they cannot participate further in the economy. It's all these things, right? This is why education is so important. But to be healthy, happy, and whole as a human being is, yet again, a different approach to education, right? If we're educating cogs in the wheel, that is skill development. If we're educating human beings, that means we're teaching them to think. We're teaching them to feel. We're teaching them to empathize. We're teaching them to see themselves in the context of each other, right? That's a different approach to education, and it's not new. It's an approach to education that historically Africans on the continent had used, and it was a tool to deal with culture, like self-concept, identity, all of these things, so the culture can perpetuate itself, right? In fact, in ancient Kemet, Egypt, there was a course of learning that often took 40 years from the time that you started until the time that your teachers felt like you had mastered yourself in order to be a value add to your people, right? 40 years of disciplined learning, scholarly research, and mastery of self, most importantly. And before you could be considered, an expert at anything, or even a valuable asset to the community, right? What would happen if we took education that seriously? And in that Kemetic context, your ka, your spirit, and your ba, your body, and your mind all became one. That was the process. That was the fundamental philosophy of that education, right? You saw yourself as an individual that you would master, that then would be connected to your community, and by extension, the cosmos, right? Not developing healthy, happy, and whole human beings who see themselves in the context of each other and in connection to the earth and the cosmos means that we are yet again perpetuating the status quo, which, as Dr. Yakovan found in his research, in the American context, the status quo is white supremacy, right? Why is that important? Because white supremacy works against everybody, including white folks who are not in the wealthier end of the spectrum, the 1%, right? We just go back and Google John Punch, 1690s, House of Burgess in Virginia, and what happened in that story, and you'll see white supremacy working against white folks. Yes?
That's it, teaching to humanize, feel, empathize, what's best for people, to have quality of life, pursuit, happiness. Yes, that's from Inspirational Soul Queen.
Thank you, Dr. E. Absolutely. So the third thing, and then I'm going to play something else and wrap this up with my ideas about solutions anyway. The educational curricula is generally not culturally responsible, let alone culturally relevant. What do I mean by that? The American education system perpetuates false narratives about America, its place in the world, how it came to that place, and what the world was before there was an America, right? What do I mean by that? We don't teach African history before the slave trade, right? Or before European imperialism. We often attribute things that happened in the Nile River Valley to China or anybody else other than, the Africans that did that, the Sumerians, the Phoenicians, anybody else, right? So, but we have the research, we have the documentation that a lot of these things happened in Africa. One example is inoculation, right? Cotton Mather, a New England minister, had a slave named Onesimus who taught him about inoculation against the Great Plague. And when Cotton Mather was telling his colleagues about this and really making the argument for vaccines of that time through inoculation, the major doctors of that time, one, didn't believe in it, and two, attributed the process to Asia. But Cotton Mather learned it from a West African who happened to be enslaved in America.
Again, from Inspirational Soul Queen, white supremacy working against white folks. I wish the poor white folks could see that and get on board with demanding social progress instead of hanging on to white supremacy.
So that's what I call the white hand of fellowship. Thank you again, Dr. E, right? One example of that, two examples, were the Freedom Riders, right? The three gentlemen that went down south to demand freedom and enfranchisement for African Americans, only one of them were African American, the other two were European American, and they all were killed in the fight for social justice, right? So white supremacy does not even see white people as part of its kind of culture unless those white folks have ascribed to white supremacist ideals. That's what makes it so insidious, yes.
Okay, so Gary Cox. Purposeful, systematic destruction of the black family. Continuance, assault from all controlling entities, reinforced with media, indoctrination, and spiritual isolation. And Dr. E says, the white hand of fellowship. Speak, Brother Mark.
See, that's that black church speak. The right hand of fellowship, the white hand of fellowship. Yeah, Uncle G, you're right. All of these things are able to continue because we are not teaching our young people what they are and arming them with the resources to not just combat them, but to change them. That's why I'm making the argument based on the research that I found that the American education system intentionally fails poor black, brown, and white students, period, point blank, because it does not prepare them to understand power, to wield that power in their own interests, right? The second example of how that works is why Fred Hampton was assassinated in Chicago, right? This young man was uniting poor black and brown urban folks in Chicago with the poor white farmers of Illinois. That's also why King was assassinated, right? When he was just talking about nonviolence and marching for black people in the South, nobody really messed with him. Yes, he was jailed. Yes, he, was stabbed and in some cases, harassed and all this other kinds of, many cases harassed. But it wasn't until he really started talking about the community of Americans beyond just issues specific to black America. The Poor People's Campaign. Now he's messing with the economy. He's coming against Vietnam. Now he's going against the power infrastructure of America. Now he's even more dangerous, right? This is why we are stronger together. Because when we come together, regardless of our ethnicities, regardless of our class background, regardless of our educational background, we are strong enough collectively to transform this country. We are strong enough together. And if we really were serious, when we really get serious about developing, cultivating, and practicing a politics of humanity, we will be educating our young people in ways that bring about that transformation, because foundational to their sense of self-concept is who they are in community with each other, regardless of how we look, regardless of our ultimate beliefs, right? So in order to fix this, we have to really shift the way we approach education. I'm gonna play something and then we'll talk about that.
We got some love for the camera angles.
Oh,
Shout out to the cinematography.
shout out to Mills James for hooking it up today. We appreciate Phil and Mike being down here and helping us get this together and take it to the next level. Ashe. I had an ancestor. This week was the birthday of Elvin Jones, who was a big deal, is a big deal to me as a drummer. So I want to honor him as well. Ashe. Okay. Power concedes nothing without demand. We have to understand power. We have to understand what concessions we want and what that looks like, right? In order to truly practice a politics of humanity and cultivate what that politics is the discussion of power, the negotiation and navigation of power. Then one of the best ways we can do that is through education. How do we know? Because this Harvard scholar said that white supremacist ideas upon which the country was founded was distributed, was handed down from generation to generation through education, right? He literally said that education is the, white supremacy is the toxin, and education was the syringe that injected this toxin into so many students, generation upon generation upon generation. So if education was the means by which bad ideas and ideals have been communicated, why can it not be the solution or the way through which the solution gets transmitted down through the generations, right? And the solution is really a focus on our collective humanity. Steve Biko said, a community is easily divided when their perception of the same thing is different. When their perception of the same thing is different, a community can be easily divided. So can a country, right? We have right now so much division. And it's not just divisive because we don't agree on the issues. We don't even see the issues the same way, right? If you are to the right or to the left, conservative or liberal or whatever politically, right? It is so divisive that I might see an orange sky and somebody else says that looks purple. Just because I said it was orange, they might say it's purple because we just cannot agree for the sake of not agreeing, right? The level of civil discourse has been not just tarnished and battered, it's gone. People just are not talking to each other in the ways that bring the country together, right? And in order for that to happen, we have to agree on what the problems are. And in order to agree on what the problems are, we have to sit together and just go through all of the crap that led us to this moment, right? And it is a lot of crap. Sometimes, you know, my father and I are talking and we talk about having to dig through, forgive the language, but dig through all the bullshit to get to the truth of something. And it might be a nugget of truth, but once you find it, you cannot unsee it. Education, I believe, is the way to help our young people dig through all the crap that assaults their psyche every day and find the nugget of truth. That nugget is that we are all human beings. I'm not feeling like I have to make the argument that I, as a black man, am a human being or that black people are human. That I take for granted, that all people are human. And if we could just agree on that, then I think it's easy for people, no matter where you are on the political spectrum, no matter where you are on the class spectrum or gender, however you identify in any kind of way, I think it's easy for us to, once we agree on our humanity, to say, you know what, as human beings, if I am so inclined to have a family, I want that family to thrive. And if I'm not inclined to have my own family, I would like, in terms of like having kids and all that kind of stuff, kind of family, I would like the people I care about to thrive, right? We have to really understand that agreeing on the real problems, the facts of our reality, is the first thing that leads us to that conversation that changes our country, right? So if we want to change the status quo, we have to change our foundational philosophy of education from the perpetuation of racist, sexist, classist, and generally othering types of ideals to a cultivation of a healthy, happy, and whole human being with the ability to think critically and act in the interest of humanity in balance with the planet and the cosmos, right? We might have to do a part 2 as 1 o'clock. But the way we really do that is to take a deep look at the Afrocentric way of thought. The Dogon have an approach to education that moves from the concrete idea to the abstract and the spiritual, all while cultivating this full human being, right? By cultivating a fully realized human being, we are catalyzing the practice of a politics of humanity, and by extension, we can change the world. Yes.
I think this is going to be a longer answer, and we are at time, but how would you say we start to educate young people? And from another comment, wholly human, but the white supremacist influenced mind still sees us as 3/5 human. We need a shift in teaching, a shift in the teaching force to their re-education.
What was the first one?
How would you say we start to educate young people? And we are at time.
Okay, I'm going to answer these questions and then we'll go. First, how do we educate these young people? Well, that's why we have to sit down and really look at American history for what it is, world history for what it is, and begin to bring the research that's telling the truth of those historic events into the curriculum. We have to literally shift the philosophy of education from one that reinforces the status quo to one that completely changes the status quo in favor of humanity. So that's first. It's not even easier said than done. It's just that we have to make the commitment and be about the work, and it will get done eventually. The second thing about humanity, yes, Dred Scott decision said that black men, or black people by extension, have no rights upon which the white man in America are bound to respect. The constitutional, what is it? I can't remember. I can't remember where in the Constitution, but it literally called enslaved Africans 3/5 of a human being, right? We know all of those things. That's why a few weeks ago I said we have to, again, come together, agree on our humanity, and look at these founding documents and these founding ideals and completely reorder them, reimagine them in a way that brings us together, right? We should have a constitutional convention, and we go through that document, that founding document, with a race, class, gender, and every other kind of equity lens, and make sure the stuff that is othering everyone gets taken out and the stuff that brings everybody together is put in, right? What I'm offering here are these, hopefully, macro ideas, these big things that can inspire people to figure out what that means to them and how they can move forward in their community. It takes each of us, each and every one of us, no matter what your race, class, gender, all of that stuff, no matter who you are, it takes each of us accepting their role in the transformation of this country and, by extension, the transformation of the world. All right, thank you for hanging out with us. We will be here next Friday. We may not be live, but there will be a Drumversations because, work and everything. I have to do some other stuff, but we'll send out communication as to whether or not we'll be live or whether it will be pre-recorded. But we're going to follow up with the conclusion of the education stuff because I want to talk a little bit about the Dogon, and we'll also talk about what it means to add value. You all have a great weekend. Thank you.